Hello, everyone. This is Tina Ramirez, and I am so glad to be with you today and to be able to share about a friend of mine, Dr. Dennis de Jong from the Netherlands, who I've known since, I guess, around 2007. So for many years, maybe, I know he doesn't want me to date him, but it dates both of us, Dennis.
That's very true.
So when we first met, and I'll share this and then I'll share a little bit more, we were just beginning to form a community of leaders from around the world that were beginning to focus on freedom of religion or belief. And we met, I believe it was in Germany. We were all huddled together in a conference room. And, it was I was a young congressional staff person at the time. So for me, it was really just this amazing experience to get to meet someone like Dr. de Jong, who has committed his life to this issue of freedom of religion or belief, but also public service, and had written so extensively on it. And so I remember afterwards I got his book, which I have. I thought I would show you. So, and it's very thick. This was a long read. And just thinking, this is like one of the most preeminent scholars on freedom of religion or belief, something that I was very passionate about and was committing my life to in my work. And just, it was really an amazing experience to be able to establish a friendship so long ago with someone that has been an inspiration and a resource to me for all of those years. So Dennis, thank you for that. And for all the work.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to see you again through the screen, but still in a direct conversation. It's very good.
I know usually we're in Europe together. So now we're, through Zoom. That's, I guess, that's the new form of travel. So,
right.
So I want Dennis to share a little bit more about his background, because I only know about it from the last 2 decades, where he was enmeshed in this freedom of religion or belief space internationally. He has done many things. He worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Justice Department of the European Commission on behalf of the government of Netherlands. And then I guess the last time I saw you was when you were the expert within the European Union on freedom of religion or belief. Or within, the European Parliament. Is that right, Dennis?
Yeah, more the European Parliament, because the EU is very broad, of course.
I know, I'm sorry.
And everything. And there are many experts there too. But in the European Parliament, that was a bit of a focal point, I think, on this issue. And you want to know where it came from, or what started it all? Or...
Yeah, let's go back and start with just, tell me about what motivated you to literally write 700 plus pages on freedom of religion or belief. How in the world, you're just a normal person in the Netherlands. This is a lot of work.
It started perhaps at college. That I know that we had a trip to Rome with school, and there we visited all the classic places from a long time ago, but also had some type of what you could call a spiritual experience there. And I was together with a group of 4, and we all had the same experience there. And it's very immaterial. You can't really, it's nothing spectacular or so, but it did give you a bit of a boost that you're not here to just enjoy yourself. It's fine to enjoy yourself, but there's also something you have to do for the world. And we definitely thought this was more of a message from God than a coincidence. And I further worked on that, I think, in a very low-key manner. This is not that I immediately entered into a monastery or something else, but during my work, it was always a bit in my background. I have to do something for others, and I also started to get myself more acquainted with the teachings in the Bible, and also went to church. My parents have always been member of the Dutch Protestant Church, but they didn't go to church themselves all the time. But I started doing that. So it's a bit opposite from what you normally see. You have parents who
Mhm.
tell you to go to church, and children say, okay, I'll go. But I actually wanted to do that. And remember, this is in the 60s of the previous century, and that was the time when we all wanted to change the world for the better. Huh? That was the general tendency. Also within the church, that was quite a tendency at that time. And I took that with me, I think. And then I went to New York at some point after my studies in the Netherlands. And I even became part of, I did confirmation in the Episcopal Church in New York, because I thought that was also a church that was very much alive in the city, but at the same time also a combination of quite the sermons we had in the Netherlands, plus more symbolics, and the sort of what we call liturgy was more high than in a Dutch Protestant church. But the looking for more than just the material life was something that started there. Then I got admitted because I had I was enrolled in the New School for Social Research, but I also got admitted to the Columbia program of the Columbia University in New York for a PhD. And at that time, I wanted to do something like that on international relations, but also with focus on human rights. And my parents stopped saying, well, they said, you've studied now for 4.5 years or 5 years, and we don't want to invest more money in your study. And I would get a fellowship, but that only started half a year later. So that went down the drain. But back to the Netherlands, I thought I do want to do a PhD. And then with my background, knowing that personal belief, faith, can inspire you throughout your life. I wanted to do that in the field of human rights, but then on this freedom in particular, because it has been important for me. It has been a driving force throughout my life and until this very day, actually. So that's the reason why I started this, thinking I could do it in a few years. And then I got one job after the other that was rather time consuming, and so it had to be done in spare time and holidays or in weekends. So it took 22 years, and that's why it was only published in 2000. But still, it has been, I think, on the sides in all of my jobs, because I had to work on this in my free time.
Wow, that is amazing that it took 22 years, but because I mean, as we often joke about, it doesn't take that long anymore to get a PhD, and so it's remarkable. And you don't have to write this big of a book to get one. So
now, if you say these days it took me 22 years to get a PhD, people would normally think you're stupid or lazy or whatever. And but this was the time when I concentrated on the United Nations, because I've always been fascinated by the United Nations, since that brings together, whether it's effective or not, but it brings together all nations in the world. And I've attended also for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs quite a few negotiations within the UN. And just this whole process of people from completely different backgrounds trying to agree or being difficult on something, but still that whole process fascinated me. And as I said, the freedom of religion or belief fascinated me. And the two together, they made it possible to write a book, but it also meant that I had to work on the basis of the UN documents. And at that time, you didn't have anything like internet where you could just click and see what documents are there. And no, I had to go to the UN library in The Hague and go to find the documents and then go to a copying machine and copy certain pages, because it was expensive to copy. You had to pay 10 cents per page, I think. So I had to be very selective on what to copy, but I still ended up with huge heaps of or packs of documents to work on. So that is already an explanation why it takes more time to do a research like that. It took more time then than it would take now. And in addition, I found out that the United Nations started in, of course, 1946 when it started. when it was first discussed in the context of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But then the number of debates were still limited, and the number of documents were limited. But the more you go in time, in the 90s, for example, it became huge, the amount, because I didn't only discuss the codification of new legal instruments, which is still something you can read of a reduced scope, but I also wanted to know what are people saying about violations of this freedom. And then you end up in the implementation debates, and that became bigger and bigger and bigger. Especially since you don't have just one debate on the freedom of religion or belief, but it is everywhere. Whether you talk about the rights of the child or gender issues, it's always, there is a link with freedom of religion or belief. So we had a cutoff date at some point in 1993, because if not, I would still be working on it, I think. That's the other reason why it took so long.
Well, I think that there's a need for a second edition, Dennis, because really the first half, I mean, it's changed so much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what were the major debates in the first like 40 to 50 years of the conversation over FORB, and what are some of the different types of debates we're having today. So I mean, you have several chapters in here. Do you want to share some of the ones that you focused on, or just a few of the different issues that were really a part of this debate?
Some issues remain the same, I think. For example, this whole, I spent quite a number of pages on the separation of church and state. And also the fact that that doesn't mean that, for example, secularism means that you don't have respect for and you don't respect the rights of religious people. But that's the fact that you need to respect all religions or beliefs in the state is still a crucial challenge, and it holds both for secular states and for let's say states which have adopted some kind of state religion. In the secular states, I sometimes get the feeling that it becomes even more acute these days, that any religious sign has to be abandoned in public, whereas we clearly have freedom to manifest one's religion or belief in private and in public, and also in community with others. And we have to, that freedom is a bit under attack, I think, if you have to ban all religious symbols in public spaces. On the other hand, you see that there are states that have identified themselves even more strongly with one particular religion, and also face persecution of other minorities. So I think that's part of the thesis that says you have to be, you cannot say, according to the UN either, or human rights, you can't have an established church in your country, but at the same time you have to take all the precautionary measures that there is no discrimination. And in my personal feeling is that if you have an established church or an established religion, and look at India, look at Saudi Arabia or Islamic states, you see that very clearly, that there are always troubles. And the discussion on that theme is as topical these days as it has been throughout those 40, 50 years, because it always came back. I remember one of the first reports of somebody called Krishna Swami in the United Nations at the time, and I'm talking now in the 50s, way back. He said, I don't have, there's no prohibition to have an established church, but you cannot discriminate. And ever since, we've seen discrimination and of other religions or beliefs when there was this state religion. I think that's still a very topical debate, and one that has become even more sensitive perhaps these days than it used to be, because we have now so many decades of discussions, and for some governments, it's even vital to be able to say, well, this is what, for example, the Sharia says, and it's the name of Allah, and we cannot change that because we have the duty as a state to protect Islamic values, because 95% of our population is Muslim, or Hindu, or Christian even. Even that can be, as we see in some Central European countries now, I think certain interpretations of Christianity are being used by the government also for their own interests. So this whole business about separation of, I would say, church and or religion and state is something a second edition could go further, could make it more modern in that sense. But it's the basic tenets I would still defend as they are in there. And the other thing that, of course, is completely missing in this book that would be very topical to deal with is digitalization and privacy. And we didn't have algorithms at the time that I wrote my thesis. And
No
still,
Facebook.
I think, no Facebook, and still, the way that we are relying on Zoom in our case, but I don't see any interference here yet, but I mean, the selection of news, the selection of views that you can express or may express, the violence on the internet that you also see. I've always been on Twitter, and I haven't been attacked all that much, but I have seen attacks on others. We now have an example in the Netherlands of a originally Turkish woman who has been living in the Netherlands her entire life, but who said, I want to free myself as a woman from not even the religion, the Islamic religion that she still adheres to, but from the cultural aspects of that I find restrictive in my case. And she wrote a book, and if you then see the attacks in social media on her, made that she had to, she has actually protection at the moment, security protection, and that you see more often. So the violence against people and the internet and the freedoms and the internet, that deserves, I think, certainly a new chapter. And it makes it completely different also because there are different dynamics than what I could foresee in my book. So on the one hand, there are certain things similar. I just picked two examples now of the state and church that is still a topical debate. On the other hand, I think the internet is definitely a new thing that with new dynamics. In the United Nations, a lot has changed when it comes to the institutions. That I still make reference to committees that no longer exist in the UN. So that's more a technical thing. But when you go to the more philosophical side, I think, we have to protect freedom of religion or belief also in social media somehow, and that's quite difficult. I think those are the two things that I would pick out of it. But there's a lot more. I mean, if you talk about, we had the 40 years, almost 40, more than 40 years, we had the communist countries, states being very much against codification of freedom of religion or belief. And then we had the fall of the Iron Curtain. We thought now there is international consensus on human rights. And you will see that reflected in the book also, that I thought, well, there's a new age of respect for human rights. We all have the same ideas. And then you see this century that, of course, that consensus does not exist. And there are other challenges coming up in the world, and also cultural challenges. You have China, you have parts of the world that used not to be developing their own set of values, are now promoting those values much more, also in the United Nations. So all these developments you will not find in the book. That was more optimistic, I think, at the time than it would be now.
Well, it's actually in so between 1992 and 1998, a lot changed. I mean, I think it was in 1989 or 1986, the Declaration on Religious Intolerance. Was it 1989? I think.
That was a bit earlier, I think 1981, if I remember well.
81. Okay.
Yeah. I thought it was
What am
81.
I thinking of? I'm thinking of the 1998, in the United States, the International Religious Freedom Act. I didn't realize it was
Okay. Yeah.
81, because you're right. It was 25 years when I had done some work on it. But, I know, but time flies. But that period in the 90s, really, you did see a shift. I remember when I first went to work in the U.S. Congress, so this was at the beginning of 2000, I guess, around that time, you had this codification in the Declaration on Religious Intolerance, the 1981 Declaration, you're right. And you began to see new debates arise around FORB. So conscientious objection, a lot of issues around conscientious objection in the former Soviet countries, and who had rights and not. And I've seen that emerge even within the medical profession, where do religious hospitals have the right to conscientiously object to certain services? Like we've had euthanasia and these other issues that have arisen worldwide. So it's been really interesting to see how we really started out with, kind of like the most basic understanding of freedom of religion or belief. You can change, you can choose, you can, express your belief, you have a right to believe. And now we're into a lot more complicated conversations. And as you were sharing about just the church state issue, it made me think about the fact that we are more globalized and interconnected. In some ways, that's great, but it also creates this fear amongst people that they're losing their culture. And what I've seen in my work around the world, more than anything, that's igniting this conflict over religion and over freedom of religion or belief, is this fear of people losing their culture. And you kind of alluded to it a little bit with the Islamic countries, but in the work that we've done, we've definitely seen that. And when we go into a country, we found that often they're given these Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They're given Article 18. They're given all these international rights, but they've never been taught how to have the conversation within their own culture and context to localize it, to make it indigenous. And so those debates happened back in the 40s, but it's almost like we need to have those conversations over again in the modern world with many new nation states. And so, for instance, like we're working in South Sudan, and they have all the right laws, on the books, but there's no embodiment of, well, what does this really mean for us? And we see those same challenges in Nigeria and India and in so many countries, in Nepal, when we were working on the new constitution in Nepal. And it seems like there is a need for a second edition and for a whole nother generation of how do we approach countries in the United Nations to really internalize and begin to understand these values of freedom of religion or belief within their own context, and embed them within their countries. That's the work that we've been doing at Hardwired, because I think it's so important that it's not an American perspective, it's not a European perspective, that it's really embedded or hardwired into each of us, that we have these freedoms, but how do you articulate that within your own cultural context?
No, I think you're very right. It's also a cultural issue, and people do feel, I think, in almost all countries, the world is becoming so much smaller in a way that you're all dependent on each other, that at the same time people are looking for something that they can hang on to. And I can see that even in my own country, in the Netherlands, let alone in countries that have a completely different, traditionally a completely different culture, and are now waking up, as it were. I think the main answer would not be so much, it's always good if governments talk to each other, but the main thing that I always try to promote these days is more grassroots level work. So if you take, for example, embassies, they can devote a lot of time in dialogue with the government, and they should do so on human rights. But then you get nice words, perhaps, if you're lucky, or it's behind closed doors only that you hear something, and then it doesn't come very far. But of course, that's their work. But at the same time, if you want to overcome cultural differences, it is a matter of people who have to work together on the ground. So I'm very interested in humanitarian aid projects that are there, where people from different religious communities, for example, are stimulated to work together to offer aid to also members of the other religion or belief than their own, and to say this is not a matter of us imposing from the West on you to do something, but the least you can do is try to understand each other and work together. Interreligious dialogue is fine. I've been to many places where you have this dialogue, and you can even have religious leaders coming together, also issuing marvelous statements and declarations that they sign up to. But it has to be translated to what people feel. And that's a huge undertaking. And I think it's not only up to embassies, it's also NGOs, civil society that can be very helpful. And it should not be seen as something only representing the Western culture for the reasons you explained, Tina. And so it's another challenge. It's not something that would have been suitable for my thesis because that was legal stuff. So I would go to texts and the interpretation of text. And this is more how you do it in practice that I've been focusing on. More recently, I think the past 10 years, it was more on how to put it in practice rather than to develop new laws or something on it. But that's right. It's quite a challenge in addition to what we already have.
So when we first met in around 2007, I remember the biggest issue at the time were these defamation of religion resolutions at the United Nations. And Pakistan, on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Conference, would bring these resolutions to the UN and basically try to criminalize speech that was offensive of Islam, of their religion. And this was, very concerning for many of us in the field, because to criminalize any kind of speech really goes against, but religious speech in particular goes against Article 18. At its core, people should be free to speak and have these debates. We shouldn't be afraid of what they're saying even if we disagree. I mean, that's the fundamental principle of FORB in many ways. But it was interesting. So back in the United States, we had the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. We had 10 years or so, more of advocacy on this. Then we started seeing these issues at the United Nations. 2009, you were elected to become a member of Parliament, of the European Parliament, and you went and you started an intergroup, a working group on FORB that didn't exist there. And I would say really in the last decade that the European community has really become much more active on FORB issues than Americans were back in the 90s. And we've really seen this shift, which is great. But that, really had to do with this work you did on this working group. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got it started? What motivated you? Why was it difficult to get it launched there? And
well, I was a bit surprised on the one hand, although I did have the experience the years before in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we had a similar challenge. And I had, as you know, written my book, and then I wanted to do something with that in the Human Rights Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there we had also the same discussion. Do we need special attention for freedom of religion or belief? And that was a bit of an interaction with some of the Christian parties in Parliament that we said, no, we do want a report of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they said, on freedom, the respect for freedom of religion or belief in the world, because we think it's important. And so it gave me support also to be a focal point in the ministry for this particular freedom. But that became wider because we had different ministers that I worked for. But one minister in particular, Van Denne, she was the one responsible for development policies. And she was herself convinced that you cannot really work with other countries on development policies if you don't recognize that there are also drivers of faith in that country that can be your allies in a way. You cannot instrumentalize them because that would be wrong for religion or belief to do that, but you can work together and see where you have common viewpoints. So in the ministry, I had already seen all the resistance within the ministry, but I had also seen that with the right attitude, and if you do it slowly and steadily and together with NGOs who were also quite interested in it, you can develop that further. So then I became elected, and human rights for me were a special field of attention. It was a bit difficult in the European Parliament because the powers it has over external policies are much more limited than when it is about internal policies, internal EU policies. But we did have resolutions, and we did have, of course, the budgetary instruments. We had to also agree on external agreements. So there were a few hooks to say the Parliament can be active in the field of foreign and development policies. So I thought with the experience I had in the Foreign Office, there will be something like this also in the European Parliament. Well, there wasn't. There had been a few resolutions, in particular on freedom of religion or belief for Christians, but a more wide-ranging interest, you could sense it perhaps, but it had never been brought together. And it's very easy in the European Parliament how you then start something. The start is easy. You just have an expert meeting where you invite people, and I invited people from the Quai d'Orsay, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because they had the presidency of the EU at the time, and also from the Dutch Ministry, my former colleagues. So when they were all brought together, they could explain to the parliamentarians, it actually does play a role in our ministries. So that was the bridge. And then you see in the parliament who is coming to such an expert meeting. And you write down the names of the MEPs coming. One of them was my Dutch colleague from, at that time, the European Conservative and Reformist Group. But he is from National Christian Party, Peter van Dalen. And we've always been a team, because I was on the left side in Parliament, the far left, and he was from the far right, if you like, still democratic, right, and so we were already extreme, so we were good friends, and we worked very closely together, and we showed to all the parliamentarians, this is not an issue of left or right, this is an issue of basic human rights. And freedom of religion or belief can be anything. It can range from humanism to Orthodox Christianity and anything else that determines an outlook on life for somebody. So if you take that perspective, then, and you have already built on our personal big coalition, then it becomes easier for others to join, and you get more response. And then we had to fight to become from a very informal. Well, that was one of the advisors actually in Parliament. They said, well, you're just a network, but you have to call yourself working group. I said, working group, but we are not a working group. Yes, but nobody knows. It's not that it's prohibited to call yourself working group. So why don't you call yourself then? So we had a big reception, invited all MEPs who were interested to join us to this working group, and it was officially launched, and then we existed. And then from there, from this still non-existent, officially at least non-existent working group, to a formally recognized network that's called Intergroup in the European Parliament, that could only be done in 2014, the next term. But it was already relatively easy because we got to know quite a few MEPs from different political groups who would support us. And you need votes from at least 3 major political groups in Parliament, and there are about 7 or 8, I think, at the moment. And they have all the priorities. One wants something on environment, the other one wants something on discrimination. And so you had to compete with many, many different fields. But if you create an alliance of MEPs, members of the European Parliament, in different political groups, it's possible to do so. And then 2014, we started for real. And that was also the change of nature, I think, that I really wanted to establish, that we wouldn't be just a talking group, but that we would also produce an annual report on the state of play in the world when it comes to freedom of religion or belief. I was, of course, inspired by USERV in the US, because they did that already. But Europe always wants to do it itself, as you understand. We always have our own accents and also sources are sometimes different. So I asked a group of academics to help us with presenting an annual report every year. And it stopped now, unfortunately, when I left the European Parliament, but it could be picked up again, and I keep pleading for it, because that strengthens the position of the Parliament and the position of this team as well. Also, many ministries, I got many diplomats asking me, can I have a copy of your report, because it's important for our work? And that's, of course, a compliment. I could present it for the Council on behalf of the European Parliament at an informal meeting, but still it was the Human Rights Working Group of the Council. And that became well and better known every year. And we became better in writing it, because the first edition is never as good as the final one. You keep improving it, and we had a system of ranking countries, and a bit like in the US, countries of concern. Of course, you have a law that's underpinning it that we don't have, that makes a difference, but still we could go into the same direction. And that was a bit my idea with that intergroup as well.
It's amazing all that you were able to accomplish and how it expanded and grew. But tell me what your approach was to dealing with foreign governments and trying to help them understand the importance of FORB.
But you have to be very concrete again and action oriented, because my plea for an interreligious council, that wouldn't go too well. I think they're there, and there's Religions for Peace who establishes interreligious councils at national levels and also at international level. But more talking, I think diplomats are not so much interested in. But if you have best practices on how can you help people? So we had examples of countries where there was a lot of prosecution, and you get testimonies, and that creates certain tension, and you give them inroads. Well, do you have contact with this organization? Do you actually meet people from that community? Or do you find it difficult? Or their leaders, if you like? Because a diplomat would not normally automatically think of a meeting with a religious leader. That's not part of the vocabulary very often. But it became less of a taboo. And then if you give them these instruments, say, well, focus now on these and these countries. And we have also, in our latest report, we also made an instrument saying how much leverage does the EU have on this country, and how much leverage has this country on the EU. If you have a very important trade relationship with the country, then of course everybody will pay lip service to human rights. But in practice, they don't want to lose that trade relationship. So we took that into account, and we identified the countries where you would actually have a high amount of persecution and a high amount of EU leverage on that country, and a lesser amount of leverage of that country over the EU. And that makes it interesting for a ministry, because they can show that they are active on freedom of religion or belief, and can maybe even be effective, even if it's small. And we show them, as I said before, the instruments. It's not only dialogue with the government, it's also looking in what's going on inside the country, and can we find allies within the country, or bring people together in the country to improve the situation. That's all the rosy picture I now describe.
Well, it's a lot more complicated, yes, I know, than we can explain. But Dennis, one of the things that fascinates me, you shared a little bit about, is that you brought these broad coalitions of of leaders together within the parliament from left to right. And I am probably farther on the right, so I understand the challenges within my space, but I would love to better understand what are some of the challenges within the left that you experienced in advocating for freedom of religion or belief. You expressed a little bit about this drive for secularism and this idea that you can't be religious and secular at the same time in a state, but what were some of the other challenges to FORB from the left that you experienced throughout your time working on these issues?
Yeah, more a matter of priority, because I don't know of any party in the European Parliament who would go as far as to publicly denounce, for example, the universality and the indivisibility of human rights. That's a core value that you would find throughout Parliament. But you do see a certain amount of priority setting, and I was very much against that on either side of the political spectrum. But on the left side, you would see more attention paid to gender issues, to social rights, economic and social rights, and less so to also freedom of expression. I think they would also pay attention to that. But freedom of religion or belief is something that could be seen as difficult in a way. Nobody is against it. I didn't meet anybody in my group who said you shouldn't be doing this. They all supported it. But if they had to choose between a variety of subjects, it wouldn't be the first subject they choose. And on the other side, we saw that certain parties on the right saw that we shouldn't be paying too much attention to all the religions or beliefs, but concentrate on Christianity, because the Christians, and I agree with that there are many countries where Christians suffer very harshly. And of course, we have many examples brought into Parliament of people who have been prosecuted, Christians who have a very difficult life in certain countries. But I also wanted to bring the Yazidis in, or bring, let's say, Muslims in India in, if need be, or the Rohingyas in Myanmar. And so there are many cases of different communities, and I felt that not only should we agree on the priority, because it is really for people essential to be able to express their religion or belief, but also to pay attention to all the various minorities that or adherents of religion or beliefs who are prosecuted. And that way I could, for example, convince the humanists who were organized inside the parliament. I said, it's also about you. If you want to talk about non-believers in certain countries where you're not allowed to not have a religious belief, then you're welcome to contribute to our intergroup. And that took away, I think, a lot of criticism from that side. So it's a matter of bringing people together also in politics, and working with academics, which I found very important to make it less political. And my main objective was really to depoliticize it and to say it's for everybody here in this parliament. And it should be a priority for everybody. So that's a bit, if you talk about differences, it was to the right, I had to say it's not only about Christians. Please be aware that you also defend it, and everybody says, yes, of course, we agree, but we also have to put it on our agenda. And to the left, prioritize the fact that there are people like me for whom religion is the driving force in your life. And if you take that away from me, you take a lot of my personality away, if not all. And that, I think, were the basic challenges. But you have a big parliament in Brussels, 751 at the time. Now it's a little less, but still it's comparable. And there will always be people who don't like the intergroup, but not everybody has to participate as long as the political groups are represented. And most of them were, I think 5 out of 7 were represented in our intergroup.
Well, there are so many cases that we could talk about. I mean, you mentioned the Rohingya, the Yazidis, and then Muslims in India. These are all groups that I've worked on. When I went to the Hill and helped build the bipartisan caucus on international religious freedom, I mean, all of those were cases that we've been working on, and now the Uyghurs, which even were a major issue at the time when I was up there. There's so many cases, and it really does exemplify that this isn't just an issue for one people group. I think for me, it's been really interesting to see how often governments in the West in particular really miss that religious dimension of what's so important, because it's like 87% of the world's population is extremely religious, and literally that's what provides them hope and their sustainability. And even if they're non-religious, they still have their freedom of conscience and belief. And so that driving force, as you said, is so critical for people around the world. And often we see in policies at the government level, it's just ignored, which is really unfortunate, because I remember watching the situation in Iraq or many other countries, but when that's ignored, people suffer. And it's the one thing that gives people such hope in times of crisis, that we shouldn't ignore it. We've seen that even this past year with COVID, that many people thought religion and belief was a luxury that could just, you don't need to go to mosque, you don't need to go to synagogue, you don't need to go to church. And it's like, well, actually, I mean, for many people, that's what helps them get through those tough times. So I feel like there's still a lot of work to do to remind people of how important that part of us is. But is there a particular case or issue that you worked on that you'd like to share about?
So many cases.
I know, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but whichever one you think.
Well, maybe it's good to highlight that as the intergroup, I try to move away from projecting our internal discussions. We've got huge emotional discussions in Europe on freedom of conscience in particular. And then I said, well, you see the difference between this, whether a cross should be allowed in a classroom, for example, of a public school, or you cannot actually be sure of your life because people might abuse, for example, blasphemy legislation in Pakistan against you. There is a difference of degree, don't you agree? And then everybody had to agree. So I think we wanted to concentrate really on the big issues of prosecution. And you will find them in many countries, although I must say that if you look at our ranking, it's particularly difficult in the Islamic world. Let's face it. I mean, in many different aspects. So we did take that in our examples, and I've done quite a bit, I think, also with best practices, how you can see certain Islamic countries who respect or make efforts. Even in Egypt, the Christian community said the Coptics, we have a different life there, a difficult life. But at the same time, we do a lot of charity ourselves. That's highly appreciated in our local communities. We get more rights now again to build our churches. So there were some signs of hope. We've concentrated also on that. And at the same time, you get from Pakistan, we got testimonies. Asia Bibi, the case that's well known, who was, I would call it still prosecuted, even if there were laws used against her. But this was, in my case, prosecution, in my vision. So we had cases like that brought to the European Parliament, and also direct testimonies from these cases. And for the rest, we've given open space. I've given space to reports from Open Doors with their own ranking on the persecution of Christians in the world. And so we could have testimonies because they brought people in from their background. And at the same time, we had the Ahmadi Muslims who are often forgotten about, but they have, and we bring them to parliament. We brought humanists to parliament. So I say there are many different cases, but the main thing they have in common is it's not on a minor issue, it's really their existence that's at stake and at issue. And if you cannot take action as a European Parliament in these cases, let's stop all the other discussions then on freedom of religion or belief, because then we don't do anything, really.
Dennis, I think that that was the perfect way to end our discussion, because you said it beautifully. I mean, if we can't do it in the most extreme cases, what are we doing talking about little, issues right around us that aren't life and death? It's so critical, and all of those communities that you described exemplify it so well. I remember being with the Ahmadiyya community in Lombok, the little island in Indonesia that is like a paradise that people go to for vacation, and yet sitting on this island are a community of people that were literally forcibly displaced, and there was like literally a genocide committed against them.
Yeah.
It's really, and I remember, being in the room with these Ahmadiyyas in Lombok and hearing how they had been moved from place to place to place, their water cut off, their resources cut off, their homes destroyed, to the point where they could not survive. They were just in a room with me. And I think that that's often what we forget. It's really the human element and helping people understand all of the people that are suffering and why this is so valuable, not just for one group, but for every group. So Dennis, thank you so much for the work you've done over the years and being able to share it with me. I've always been a huge fan and appreciated everything you've done. You've really been a unique voice because, in this space where there's so many advocates, that are really, I think, within a particular group, it's good to have a broad base of support from left to right and, everything in between.
Thank you very much, Tina, for all the nice words. And the only thing I don't like is we have to cut it off, because we could speak for hours, I think, on this issue.
I know we could. Well, yes, we could. I know. It's okay. It's kind of like your book. You need a second edition. We'll do a second edition of this as well.
Very well. Good luck with everything.
And now that you're, out of the parliament and really on the board of the Dutch group that's looking at these issues, you're able to have a little bit more fun with it, probably. So we can do, version 2, life after
I would
government.
certainly be interested in specific research. I wouldn't be doing, a general book anymore. But I've always said that now, after retirement, you have some more time. And now there is a purpose with this platform, I think, to organize meetings again. But maybe we can also do certain research on specific themes. So I'm definitely not retired 100%. Certainly not on this issue.
Well, my grandpa wrote 4 books after he retired, and we shared how my grandpa recently passed away. And that's your golden years to just write and I think share all of your wisdom with the world. So I hope that you will, because I look forward to reading it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis.